Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here today. I think I will actually provide a bit of a bridge between the previous block on future skills and the public perspectives on upskilling and reskilling, because actually in our work at the OECD, we've worked extensively both on the issue of future skills, so what is needed, but also how can we enable individuals to gain these skills from an international perspective. So some insights on that from me today. Brief recap, you've just heard this already from the previous speakers, but of course, already before the COVID-19 pandemic, technological change, the green transition, globalization and population aging were these major disruptors of labor markets and had important consequences for skill demand and supply. And while there are still many unknowns, of the shape of the recovery as we emerge from the pandemic, the review that we've conducted at the OECD to date suggests that labor market are not going to go back to usual. I mean, I think we know this, I'm at home at the moment. So, there are different skills required for us to perform our jobs. And the post-crisis labor markets will likely be characterized by, profound reorganization of work, changed demand for different occupations, and also accelerated technology adoption. To recap some of these big trends that have been discussed this morning, so of course technology will continue to affect the types of jobs that are created and their content. At the OECD, we have estimated that about 15% of jobs today in the OECD could disappear due to automation, but another 32% of jobs could see significant change in the way they are performed. And of course, that is probably the bigger challenge. How do we need to respond to these changing skill requirements of jobs through technology? The second big topic, of course, green transition, which we also believe will drive significant changes in skill requirements. So, there's a growing importance of sustainable development, to shift to a low carbon economy, and it will require new skills and qualifications, and has some potential to create new green jobs, but also implies, of course, structural changes and the transformation of existing jobs. Globalization continues to be an important topic, so that has influenced skill demand a lot in the past, but I think will continue to influence skill demand. So, the progressive fragmentation of production across borders has resulted for most OECD countries in a reduction of the demand on low-skilled workers in the country relative to medium and high-skilled workers. And there's a bit of an open question now following COVID, following COVID and following supply chain issues that we are facing in many OECD countries, how much there will be a reshoring of activities, and maybe some of those lower skilled jobs will come back to OECD economies. And finally, we shouldn't forget that population aging, of course, continues to affect skill demand and supply. So in the OECD countries, we expect that the old age dependency ratio is going to double, between now and 2050. And longer working lives mean that individuals will need to maintain and update their skills over one's career to remain employable. But they also imply that there might be higher demand for some services in aging society. So if you think about healthcare, and we already see now that emerging from the pandemic, many OECD countries came out with really severe shortages in the area of health and care. So that just recaps the content, some of which we've already heard in the previous session today. So at the OECD, we try to understand if countries are ready to address these challenges through upskilling and reskilling measures. And already in 2019, we launched this dashboard of priorities of adult learning. And what we did there is that we compiled 52 indicators on adult learning along 7 dimensions. I'm showing them to you here. So those are, for example, the coverage of adult learning systems, how many people participate, how many employers are offering training. There are the inclusiveness, what are participation gaps between different groups. They relate to the flexibility of training provision. For example, you mentioned it earlier, is online learning available, and to what extent are people taking part in it? So these are all the dimensions that we looked at when we try to judge how future ready different OECD adult learning systems are. And to be honest with you, we found that while many countries are facing these pressing skill challenges, they generally have adult learning systems that are underprepared to address these challenges, and they face challenges in different areas. So to give you a little bit more detail about the results, this might be difficult to read, but I'm going to talk you through this slide, and I hope that you can also access this later through our clickable dashboard online. You see kind of underneath here that you can find the Future Ready Adult Learning Systems dashboard on the OECD website. If you just put that in your search engine, you will be able to find more detailed information and click yourself through the detailed results of this dashboard. But a little bit of reading help here. So the longer the bar in each of these dimensions, the better the performance of a specific country. And an exception is the urgency dimension, which you see on the left-hand side here, where the shorter is better because skill challenges are less urgent when the bar is shorter. So let's look at some examples here. I'm showing you Norway and New Zealand, which are performing well on most of the dimensions. So they have pretty long bars here in coverage. They have, very high participation throughout the board. They have very little gaps between different groups in participation. They have a very flexible system. They provide guidance to individuals to participate in training. Their training is aligned with labor market needs. It has an impact. They are, able to produce results. People are more employable, get promotions, etc. when they come out of training, and the financing is very sustainable. So those are kind of the high-performing countries, but you can see that they also have issues in some areas. So actually, Norway, for example, is not doing so well when it comes to impact. Or New Zealand is not doing so well when it comes to financing. So even those countries that we consider benchmarks or very high performers in an OECD context may still have issues. I also wanted to briefly show you Latvia, where we unfortunately have some data gaps because we don't have Latvian data in the participation in the OECD Survey of Adult Skills. But what you can see here is that skill challenges are relatively urgent in Latvia. So really long bar here in the urgency dimension. And that the country is doing relatively well with regards to impact. So the usefulness of training is high, and not so well on financing. So maybe some worth thinking about, how the system could be more sustainably financed through individuals, enterprises, and then the public purse as well. Let me give you a bit more detail on countries' performance from an international perspective. So here I'm showing you some data on the participation and willingness of adults to train across countries. And I can tell you that only around 41% of adults across OECD countries do train in a given year. So sort of 2 in 5 individuals train in a given year. And so, the majority of people don't participate in training in a given year. You can also see here that 11% would actually like to participate, but don't for a number of reasons. For example, because they lack time due to work or family related reasons, or they have some lack of financial resources to participate in training. Again, you can see that some countries are managing better here to engage adults in learning than others, and notably, these are the Nordic countries. So on the left-hand side here, you have Denmark, Norway, Finland, and also followed by Sweden. So quite high participation there, but also New Zealand, which manages to engage a relatively high share of adults in learning. Now, what I think is even more interesting is that there's huge gaps in participation between different groups. So you can see here, this is cross-country comparative data. So this is all the OECD countries for which we have data available. And you can see the participation gaps between different groups. So you can see here, for example, the differences in participation between the medium and high skilled and the low skilled, different age groups, employment statuses, wage, women and men, and also employment status. So do you work in a larger or in a smaller enterprise? And what stands out to me here is that there's really the largest gaps are between the low skilled and the medium and high skilled. So here you can see about 20% of low skilled adults participate in learning every year, but more than double of the medium and high skilled adults participate every year. And equally, you have quite large gaps between the long-term unemployed and the employed. So, once you've been unemployed for quite a long time, it's quite unlikely for you to participate in training. And that is, of course, an issue if you do want to be joining the labor market again in the future. The final piece of information that I wanted to show from the dashboard is that We don't have that good information about the impact of training from an international perspective, and even at a national level, often training measures are not well evaluated, and we don't know if they make a difference in people's lives, if they make a difference to people's employability. But here is what we know from some self-reported measures. And what I show you here is some data from the European Adult Education Survey, where people are asked if they have experienced positive employment outcomes following training. So what does that mean? That means, for example, did they get a new job? Did they have a higher salary? Did they get a promotion? Did they get some new tasks or some other kind of qualitative improvement of their employment situation following training? And this is what people answer across the EU. Around 2 in 3 adults say, yes, following training, I have experienced positive employment outcomes. But again, huge differences between countries. You know, in Belgium, UK, Poland, more than 70%, and also Latvia, you have here actually more than 70% of people say, yes, training has been very useful for my employment outcomes, whereas in other countries, here on the right-hand side, Germany, Turkey, the Netherlands, a very, very small share of adults actually say that it has made a difference by international comparison. So what does this mean for policymakers? We have identified 6 key areas of actions for policymakers. I could talk about this for hours, so I'm going to have to whiz you through the recommendations that we have. The first one is, of course, we need to improve the coverage and the inclusiveness of adult learning. And how do we do that? You know, we need to improve basic skills for adults so they can actually continue learning. If you lack the basic skill levels, and you talked about digital skills before, if you lack the basic digital skills, you may never make further steps to actually engage in learning. We need to recognize the prior learning that individuals already have, that they have acquired in the labor market, in their jobs. We need to have them certified and recognized when applying for jobs. And we also need to inform, help adults to make informed choices about education and training, for example, through information campaigns, but also through career guidance and helping them to identify the importance for engaging in training and what options are available to them. The second key area of action is we need to align training content with labor market needs. And for that, it's very important for governments to collect and use information on current and future skill needs, to really design learning policies that are strategic, that are based on good quality evidence, and that are bringing people closer to the labor market, and also closing some of those shortages that I mentioned in the beginning. And we need to stir individuals and providers of training towards these skills and demands. So incentivizing individuals to take up learning in areas where there's a real shortage of labor. The third area of action is we need to improve the quality and the impact of training provision. How do we know that? I said earlier, there's a huge kind of gap in knowledge that we have on the effectiveness of training programs and training providers. So there's more investment needed from the public side and more interest needed from the research side to really produce that evidence for better policy making. We also need to build the capacity of providers to implement quality assurance system and also share information on quality and effectiveness of programs with providers, but also with individuals, making it transparent. What is a good training? Maybe having some online portal where individuals can judge how well a specific provider or a specific program worked for them. So transparency can help a lot to improve the quality and the impact of training provision. Our fourth recommendation is that we need to put in place adequate and sustainable financing. What does that mean? It's hugely complex. Maybe the things that we can give as pointers for policymakers here is, we need to ensure adequate public financing, but of course we also need to incentivize employers to contribute to the financing of adult learning through subsidies, through tax incentives, through loans, through job retention schemes. There's many, many good examples in OECD countries how employers can be incentivized to offer more training to their employees. And we also need to compensate adults who face barriers to training, for direct course costs, but also for indirect costs of learning, such as foregone wages, transport, childcare costs. And we can do that again through subsidies, through tax incentives, and other financial measures. We need to leverage technology, and what we mean by that is both in delivering training and also matching people with the right training opportunities. We've just finished a project at the OECD where we look at the use of AI in training. So if that interests you, you can find that online as well. But there's a real opportunity for the use of new technologies and making learning more tailored and more accessible to a wider group of individuals. And finally, we need to strengthen governance mechanisms. In a lot of OECD countries, the skills system is quite fragmented, and there's many providers, many actors involved, and it's really about taking a more strategic approach, a more consolidated approach across different stakeholders and involve them in the governance. And notably, there is a need to improve collaboration between education and training providers and employers so we can get this alignment right between what the labor market needs, what individuals need, and how that can be delivered. That's my presentation for today. I'm looking forward to follow-up questions, and I have put here my email address if you want to contact for any further questions, and also our website where you can find a lot of these outputs that I have mentioned, and do some further reading if that interests you. Back to you.
Anja, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm going to quickly use my moderator's status to ask a question, because I think I probably wasn't the only one over here in the Baltics whose ears pricked up when you said that the Nordics are so good at encouraging and engaging adults in lifetime learning. And I'm wondering, can you give us in a nutshell why? What is it that they do so well? Perhaps from those 6 points, which you mentioned at the end of your presentation, that allows them to have these high levels of engagement, maybe things which we could adopt over here as well.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting because there's also a bit of a path dependency there, right? There's a long history of lifelong learning in the Nordics, from really like starting 100 years ago when, the folk high schools were established and really a culture of learning took place. But I do think that there's definitely some factors that other countries can learn from. The high level of public support. I mean, really the financing and the investment in learning is very, very high for adults in those countries. And it is also in thinking about those groups that are furthest away from the labor market. I mean, if I think, for example, I'm just picking out one country at random, but when I think about Norway, they actually, for example, have specific programs for low-skilled individuals that they can learn and acquire basic skills in the labor market, in their workplaces, which is really an international good practice. So thinking about how you can raise the average, how you can raise the general tide, the general participation level through addressing those that are participating least. Because we know, like you said earlier, you are looking up things on YouTube. We are all learning online, but like, how can we really raise the participation of those that maybe don't have the means or the time or the money to participate? And I think that's what the Nordics are doing quite well in general.
Thank you. And we've had quite a few questions come in on Slido, so Parsla.
Yes, we did. But Anja, thank you for your summarizing slide with the 6 action points. I think they pretty much give answers to all the questions we have asked. But just maybe to add the cherry on the top, there was one question asking if you could suggest which are the sections of the model for the country which you would suggest to start with.
Interesting, because I don't think we have that one size fits all solution. I mean, one of our role at the OECD is to work with countries and like find out where the starting points are, like where is the biggest barrier, the biggest problem in a country to build more future ready adult learning systems. So I think it probably differs between countries, but bringing the relevant actors together on a table, starting with the governance, that was the last point I mentioned, but really like starting to identify who is involved in the skill systems. It's so vast, there's so many providers, there's so many employers, there's so many social partners, and starting that conversation together and engaging them from the beginning, that's probably what I would highlight as the appropriate starting point.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that was a great presentation.